Hey everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and go over the second half of the reading Bailey's book, the three remaining chapters, and just kind of again point out the key areas that I think are helpful to know. So, starting with sex control, this chapter is really about how there's a change in who has authority over sexual behavior. So I think prior to a modern society, and even I'd say in the 19th century, family and religion really had more authority over this kind of behavior. And so we would say that authority is within the private sphere. But starting in the 1920s and onwards, authority became more of it took the shape of a more public form, and specifically in the academic world. And so she says on page 77, public discourse centered on proscribing, regulating, and categorizing with regard to sexual behavior. There's also a huge concern of the older generation about sexual behavior. And so the older generation really felt um, that the youth need to be supervised, especially those who are in these romantic relationships. So again, as far as Bailey is looking at it, she's not really looking at what people are actually doing, but what was believed to be normative, and how those ideas about what would be normal was being constructed. And so again, the older generation and the academic world were really providing these norms of what were acceptable boundaries for sexual behavior. And then the youth was sort of comparing and conforming to these norms in terms of their romantic relationships. The other main point I wanted you to get in this chapter is the role of men and women in these romantic relationships and who was sort of navigating these boundaries. And so, for the most part, it was women that were largely put in charge of setting and enforcing sexual limits. And she was usually at fault if a line was crossed. And her reputation was at stake more so than his. Again, not necessarily, you know, in terms of actual experience, but just sort of what were the sort of normal assumptions about what men and women should be doing. Women were sort of expected to draw the line in the sand and maintain it. So on one hand, men were expected to have sex for their health, and it was seen as a very positive thing, whereas women were asked to abstain from sex in order to maintain her virtuous status. And I think Virginie really played a huge role for women more so than men because it was tied to their value, and whether or not that romantic relationship would lead to marriage. And so to prove her worth, she would limit her sexual behavior. And in return, she would then hopefully, right, this is the normal way of thinking at this time period, that if she preserved her limited her sexual behavior, she'd be rewarded with this ultimate relationship, or what we call marriage. Okay, so that's that chapter. Moving on, the next chapter again is looking at gender, but from a different vantage point. I think at this time period, because women were entering the public sphere in a much greater percentage than it had before, this creates kind of a crisis in terms of what is normal for men and women in their behavior. There's a lot of uncertainty. Whereas before, there's like a clear line between the public sphere and the private sphere. Men were in the public sphere and women were in the private sphere, but these worlds were now blending. And there was a lot of concern for how do we behave now that things are changing. So first, she kind of points out this what she calls a crisis of masculinity. And again, this sort of blending of worlds, men really felt undermined in terms of what they felt their fundamental role of a provider that was being directly challenged. And they felt that when women were entering this public sphere, they were exercising so much power, and it was threatening for men in terms of how he saw his purpose of being the more powerful, dominant role in the public sphere. There's also a crisis of femininity that she talks about too. That women also were trying to understand that, okay, I'm entering the public sphere, but do I behave like a man? Do I behave like a woman? And so this crisis of what does it mean to be a woman? and sort of femininity aspect of their gender really became challenged. And there was a fear that by entering the public sphere that she was emasculating men. And so the assessment of this crisis then was that the problem was that there was too much togetherness, right? So the public and private are blending. So there's too much of men and women together. And the solution was that men and women need to have separate identities, separate roles, and separate places, especially in the public world. And so what you have happening, especially when we get to like the 1940s and 50s, is an emphasis on traditional constructs of gender. So for women, the emphasis was on her being nurturing, submissive, dependent, and men, more traditional ideas that he should be powerful, dominant, aggressive, ambitious. And I think having these sort of like clearly defined roles helped people to feel better given the social changes that were happening in the economy and in the workplace. Okay, so the last chapter I'm going to review is the scientific truth and love chapter. So as the idea about courtship and dating was entering the public sphere, um, who was sort of deciding who had the authority, right? So I had mentioned this earlier. And it was the academy, the academic community that had sort of a cultural authority. Again, this idea of like shaping norms and defining what we can and cannot do. And all these major cultural changes are happening, that in the public realm, there was a real concern that the American family had been undermined. And so the academic world kind of came into play to kind of mitigate and assuage those fears, namely by a huge increase in research being done on the family. She says on page 122, the professionals had declared themselves the new arbiters of convention and morality, translators and preachers of their own science of family living. And so you had research then supplanting traditional sanctions that we would normally find in family or religion in a community. So that's a major change that's happening during this time period. And then lastly, I just want to point out the rise of what were called marriage courses. So marriage courses were offered at many universities. At times they were required courses. And these were studies, and they utilized studies that I mentioned before about the research that was being done. So she mentions that there's three key components of the marriage courses. The first is the functional side of it. And so they would present scientific findings to contribute to what they felt would achieve a successful marriage. And it was more of the practical side of the research. So how should men and women perform in a romantic relationship, and to essentially train them for their future roles in a marriage. So that's the functional side, again, the practical side of the course. The second is the personal component of the course. And this was the use of personal authority to counsel students and locate the emphasis of the course on individuals. And so shaping the course in a way that helps students access the information personally relevant. Didn't necessarily look at the institution or history or context of the larger society, but rather how this marriage course impacted their personality and their relationship. And then lastly, the normal component of the course emphasizes the prescription and proscription aspects of these studies, which is to say, what should you do, what should you not do, looking at how these academic experts had the right answers, how to guide on how to carry out a normal type of romantic or marriage-based relationship. So there's not really a discussion about how these norms and truth, or even truthfulness, were sort of determined in their research, but rather just how do we prepare students for these actual roles? Here's a set of norms that will provide for you to help you feel like you can have this sort of satisfying, healthy, successful marriage. All right, so that concludes the review of the second half of the reading for the family. So I'll log off for now. Bye.